On Sunday, Russia's military continued to fire rockets into the eastern region of Luhansk and Dnipro, destroying the airport there completely.
Well, last night, the US committed to providing more weapons to Ukraine to defend itself against the next Russian offensive suspected in eastern Ukraine.
Well, let's find out more. Jamil Jaffer is former defence and intelligence advisor to George W. Bush and joins us now from Virginia. Thank you very much for your time. Explain to us Biden's strategy now.
Well, look, I think the strategy remains largely the same as it was, which was to provide the Ukrainians with as much weaponry as possible in order to allow them to defend themselves and to hopefully take the offense and take the advantage against the Russians, who are now at some level retreating from their initial advance on Kyiv, but are now focused on the areas they'd always wanted, which are the Donbass region, as well as the port city of Odessa.
Look, I've been looking at some of the notes about what you've said over recent days. You seem to be saying that it's time for boots on the ground. That would be a huge step, wouldn't it?
It absolutely would. But look, the situation we're seeing on the ground is terrible. Over 10 million people displaced, 6.5 million within Ukraine itself, thousands of civilians dead, continuously being targeted by the Russians, hospitals, schools, and the like being targeted by the Russians. The situation is getting worse by the minute, and Putin has very little incentive to negotiate. While he is focused on the eastern part now, the fact of the matter is that he will try to starve the Ukrainians out, force them into submission, and that is bad for civilians in Ukraine. It's bad for the Western alliance writ large. At some point, we have to say enough is enough and start to take action on the ground.
But how does that happen without, in effect, pulling NATO into this in a way that Putin can then use to his advantage?
Well, look, there's an argument that Putin may try to conduct a conflict or claim the conflict against NATO, but the reality is that he began this fight, right? He came into Ukraine illegally, and NATO, if it has a role to play, its role is to, one, defend the alliance itself, but it's also to defend the greater part of Europe in order to prevent a war from spilling over. At this point now, we see an ongoing conflict, huge civilian casualties. NATO's gotten involved in much smaller fights before. This is one that is worth fighting. It's also worth sending a message to the Chinese saying that you can't take Taiwan without a fight. They're watching what's happening right now in Ukraine and assuming that the U.S. and the rest of our allies don't have the stomach for a real fight.
What other options do the US have to really engineer some kind of action that might have an impact on what's happening?
Well, look, if we're not going to go in with either some sort of a air defense zone or boots on the ground, the next best option is what we're doing today, but doubling down for real on it. In addition to providing the weapons we're providing now, authorize our allies to provide weapons like the MiG-29s that the Ukrainians have long been seeking, as well as some of the missile defense and offensive missile capabilities they've been looking for. We still haven't provided those yet. More work to be done there. And frankly, to triple down on the sanctions that we've imposed, which have been strong, yes, thus far, but we haven't gone after some of the major Russian entities, including Gazprom and other entities. Those are worth doing too. If we're not going to go in militarily, those are things that have to be done. Frankly, should have been done well over a month or 2 months ago.
Yeah, the MiG-29 issue is an interesting one, isn't it? I mean, obviously you're not supporting the Biden administration, but what was their thinking behind blocking that move, which President Zelensky, he was desperate for those MiGs.
That's right. He came to Congress here in the United States and asked for them directly and also asked for that air defense zone. Now, at the end of the day, the Biden administration's position on this is it doesn't want to provoke a further conflict with Vladimir Putin. It doesn't want to suggest him that we're more involved than we already are. But the fact of the matter is, Putin knows how involved we are. We're supplying all sorts of weaponry to the Ukrainians. The idea somehow that we wouldn't provide the weapons that they say they need to defend themselves and to protect Ukraine and to protect those civilians seems odd at best. And the claim being we don't want to antagonize Vladimir Putin. He's already in a war that he started for no reason other than to aggrandise himself. And so the idea that we might dissuade him from doing more by not putting the MiG-29s in just doesn't make a lot of sense to me.
You've suggested boots on the ground. How would that go down with the population?
Well, look, this is always a challenge, right? The United States and our allies in Europe have somewhat of a hangover from the Iraq War and the long Afghanistan war that both of which have now largely come to a close for us. But the fact of the matter is that we cannot reject our own leadership role in the world, neither the United States nor the Western alliance. And much less can we ignore that reality in the heart of Europe, right there in Ukraine. The idea that we would allow a war like this to fester and go on and allow this many civilians to be killed simply demonstrates that we don't have the ability to defend our own neighborhood, much less protect other allies across the globe. And so that's one of the challenges, I think, that we face there if we don't, in fact, take action and let this war fester for much longer.
OK. Look, Jamil Jaffer, formerly advising in the White House, thank you very much. And it's fascinating to get your perspective. Thank you. And we're hitting that point now, aren't we, Rosie, where it's, in some respects, Russia's retreating to a particular enclave. I mean, they said this further attack could happen. But is now the time to really push from the West to try and clear him out?
We'll have to see today how that first face-to-face meeting with Putin goes, to see if any conversation can engineer any sort of traction in terms of peace. It's obviously been ferociously difficult, and the death toll is mounting as long as that takes.